So as I said earlier, it's Father's Day, and Father's Day is an interesting day because church leaders everywhere get slated if they talk about it, and also if they don't. You can't really win. We have to acknowledge that there are many people, perhaps even some in this room today, who have not had a good relationship with their father. There are loads of fathers who don't take the responsibility of fatherhood as it should be taken. There are some who walk out on their family. Others subject them to abuse of different sorts. Still, others make it difficult because of drink or drugs or gambling or whatever. I can't deny that there are awful fathers in the world. And if you are a father, it's all too easy to look back and think, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I hadn't said that. Because we get it wrong. We're human. And if you are in that place where it's been difficult for you, then I'm sorry that you've been hurt. Truth be told, there are some pretty awful mothers as well. But also brothers and sisters. Life isn't straightforward. It isn't easy. And sometimes when we talk about these things, it brings up things we would rather not think about. But when I'm talking about God, I want to tell you that I'm talking about a good father. Somebody who is for us, who wants what's best for us, who does his best and gave his best for us. And so even though that might not be your understanding or your experience of what a father is, would you bear with me while we talk about it today? In Roman Catholic tradition, fathers have been celebrated since the 14th century. Their feast takes place on the 19th of March in the celebration of St. Joseph. But outside the Catholic tradition, it wasn't until 1910 that Father's Day came. Sonora Dodd had been raised with her 5 siblings by their father. He was a hero of the Civil War, and he had brought them up on his own after his wife died. They lived in Spokane, Washington, and they were members of the Old Centenary Presbyterian Church. Good old Presbyterians. They get into everything. One Sunday she had gone to church and she heard about Mother's Day, which was just beginning to take off. And she decided that her father and other men who had given up so much for their families should also be honored. She suggested June the 5th, which was her father's birthday. But the ministers in the congregation said no, that was too soon. They weren't prepared for that. So they would put it off for a couple of weeks, and also that would give them time to speak to other folks in the community. And so on June the 19th, across that city, fathers were honored. Various attempts since then were made to have it made into an official holiday, but it wasn't until 1966 that Lyndon B. Johnson officially designated the 3rd Sunday in June to be Father's Day. And it was actually Richard Nixon who made that a law. And so here we are. We have taken that on board, and here we are today. I want to show you a video that just retells the story from the perspective of the son and the father.
You ever get tired of your just boring day-to-day life? I do. I should say I did. Then I decided to do something about it. Conventional wisdom says you live your life, you grow up, your parents die, they leave an inheritance for you. That wasn't working for me. I wanted to enjoy that inheritance now, so I decided to do something about it. So one day, I walked straight up to my dad, looked him square in the eye, and I said,
"Dad, I want what's coming to me right now." That's what my youngest son said to me. At that moment, all I could think of was, I'd like to give what's coming to him right now. But he's my son, and I love him. And as much as it put an ache in my heart, I gave him the money, and I told him that he could go search for a life on his own. Not long after that, he packed his bags, and the next thing I knew,
I was out of there. The friends, the food, the clothes, it was great. Until
my son's money ran out around the same time the country hit a recession.
it was bad. Really bad. I'd squandered everything my dad had given me, and I didn't have anywhere to live, anything to eat. So it was hunger pains, a constant reminder of how I'd squandered my life away. I lived in agony day after day.
After day after day, I would watch and I would wait. And my heart would ache, as only a heart can, from a parent to a child. But hear me on this. I never once gave up on my child. I knew that he would come back one day.
One day it hit me. I realized my dad's lowliest worker was living like a king compared to me. So I had an idea. See, I would go up to him and I would humbly just ask him for a job. I couldn't expect him to take me back as his son, but maybe he would give me a job, just maybe.
It was a beautiful day. I was sitting there on the porch, just enjoying the cool breeze, and that's when I saw him.
He stood up. He looked in my direction, and he squinted his eyes to kind of get a better look at me. Wondered if he would take me back. And then my dad jumped off the porch.
You know what I did next? I ran.
I'd never seen him run so fast. He was like this kid who was excited about something, and then I realized he was excited about me.
My heart was pounding so fast, I just had to get to him.
He was running at me with his arms stretched out as if to say, "Welcome home."
Welcome home! Welcome home! And as I got closer to him, I could see tears in his eyes.
My dad was crying.
Tears of joy. And you know what my boy did next? He jumped.
I couldn't help it. I jumped right into my dad's arms, and you know what he did?
Well, I fell backwards. He's a big boy.
He held me. He held me like only a father could. I just kept saying to him over and over again, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't deserve to be called your son."
My son is home. Get him some clean clothes. Get him some shoes for his feet. Let's prepare a meal. No. Let's prepare a feast. For my son will no longer live as an orphan. Today we will celebrate, for all my hopes have come true.
I guess it was hope. Hope that kept me going all those days. Hope that my father would show me mercy. Hope that somehow he would take me back and that I could be forgiven.
Forgiven. It is all forgiven. It is forgotten, and I will never bring it up again. There is no anger, there is no shame, there is no blame. All that's left is just pure joy. For my child was lost, and now he's found.
It's a very well-known story. Even people who don't go to church would know the idea of being a prodigal. But it's not really about him. We call it the story of the prodigal son. But it starts, a man had 2 sons. It's a story about God. Paintings have been done over the years celebrating and remembering the story. And the best one, perhaps, is by Rembrandt. And there it is. Can't see it terribly clearly here. You can't see it terribly clearly anyway, because it's quite dark. But what you see there is the son, and he is being held by his father, and on your right-hand side is the brother, the older brother with a red cape on, with the arms folded, watching what on earth is going on. But there's other things in the picture that you might not notice from there. So it shows the son with only one shoe. The other one's fallen off. It shows how far he's traveled to come home. It shows in the background. Now, I had to take my computer and play about with this. But in the background, where it looked really dark, there's a woman watching what's happening. Is it the mum? Is it a servant? We don't know. It doesn't tell us. And then it shows the father's hands. And if you look at them closely, it doesn't show it terribly well there, but his right hand, the one on your left, looks like a woman's hand when you see the picture. And his left hand on your right is a man's hand. And it speaks about that character of God that is both male and female. It's a story of repentance and the wonderful redeeming grace of God. But it's also about more than that. When the father divided his possessions into two, I suspect it means that the young son then sold off the land and the property to get the money. The father wouldn't have had the money to give him. But that act would have brought real shame on the family. And that would only have added to the shame already experienced by this young man coming to ask his father for his share of the inheritance that you get when you die. So essentially, he has said to his father, I wish you were dead. And even today, there are people in traditional cultures like the Navajo who find this story utterly incredible. Why would a dad do that? They just don't get it. They don't understand why the father just didn't beat him and throw him out. Nowadays in the West, at least, we're used to our children growing up and leaving home. They go off to study, they go off to work, and it's not a really big issue. But in Jesus' day, it was a shameful thing for the boy to do. It was as if he was abandoning his obligations to his father in his old age. And then, of course, once he goes, he ends up at the ultimate low point, where as a Jew, he is working with pigs, animals that were deemed to be unclean. But then you have this character of the father in the story. It's a culture where senior figures are far too dignified to run anywhere. Well, I get that because I wouldn't run anywhere either. It's just not pretty. But as soon as he sees the son, he takes to his heels. Doesn't care what anybody else says or thinks. Doesn't care that people see him. What is important is that this son has come home. And so this is Jesus' way of telling the folk who were listening to him why there is a party and why there are celebrations when someone turns from going their way and begins to follow God's way. And what he's saying here is, because the condition the son was in, there was nothing in him to commend him to his father. He was dirty and smelly, and he had been disobedient. And yet, his return was a genuine cause for celebration. There's another dimension to the story which, in our context, it's easy for us to miss. One of the great stories in the Old Testament is the story of the Exodus. When Israel was brought up out of Egypt, you may have seen the cartoon film that Disney did. It's very good. There's been others since then too. They come up out of Egypt and they get to the promised land. And then, many years later, after rebelling against God, they're taken into exile in Babylon, which is at miles and miles from their home. And even in Jesus' day, the Jews were still waiting for a new exodus when all those folk who'd been taken into captivity and were living all over the world would come back. And they would come back to Israel. So for Jesus to tell this story of a wicked son who was lost in a foreign land, who was welcomed home to a lavish party, was bound to be heard by those people who were listening to him as a reference to the hope of Israel. From the exile, the idea of resurrection had been used as a picture language for the true return of the people home. And Jesus is saying to them, it's happening right here and right now. Not in the way you expect, but it's happening because people are believing and trusting in God. And then the addition of the older brother. Sometimes we forget the older brother. But the addition of the older brother is Jesus' response to those religious people who criticized him constantly. They were always having a go at him because he didn't meet their expectations of what it meant to be religious. They were focused on the wickedness of the tax collectors and sinners and criticized Jesus for having anything to do with them at all because they weren't good enough. They weren't holy enough or clean enough. They could only see the bad in them, not the beauty. And as they watched Jesus, they had seen people being transformed physically, spiritually, emotionally, and morally, but they still complained they could only see these other folks as human rubbish that they would normally avoid. There are two important phrases in this story. The elder brother, you'll notice, can't bring himself to say brother. What he says is, this son of yours. This son of yours. It doesn't say my brother. I want nothing to do with him. I sometimes say that about our children. Do you know, Linda, you'll never guess what your son has done now. But he just can't do that. He can't bring himself to say my brother. And then he claims to have been slaving for his father when actually they had been partners in everything. Because everything that was there was his. It belonged to the son. And he was working with, not for, his father. And presumably that's part of the problem, though. Because whatever now goes to the young one is coming out of his money. And he didn't like it. The second phrase is where he says, I've never disobeyed a single command of yours. That was what the religious people said. That was what they thought. We are obeying God. We're doing what God says and we've not been disobedient. But their moral superiority is shown as worthless in the face of God's grace and mercy. Where new life is happening, it's not only appropriate, it's necessary to celebrate. Verse 32, the father said, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. If you read the stories about Jesus in the New Testament, you see that he welcomed the outcast, the lost, the people that nobody else wanted. He showed them love and compassion and mercy. And as a result, lives were transformed. But wherever God is at work, there are those muttering in the background that God shouldn't be generous. What does he think he's doing? How could he deal with them? The story reveals the self-centeredness of the older brother. His reaction shows that he doesn't actually have any more respect for his father than his younger brother. He lectures him in front of their guests, and he refuses to come in. But the father still continues to show generosity. And there's a sense there that Jesus is not just telling his listeners that they're out of line, because that's part of the story, they are out of line, but also that God's generosity is reaching out to people they didn't expect it would reach. It reaches those parts that others don't. But it doesn't mean there's none left for the Pharisees and the people who think they don't need it. There's more than enough grace and mercy for everybody. But if the Pharisees and the religious people insist on staying outside of the party because they don't like it, it's not because God doesn't love them too. Luke is writing this story after Jesus has gone back to heaven. This is the early days of the church. And in those early days of the church, new people were coming to faith. Gentile people. And some of the Jewish believers were having a real problem with that. They didn't understand that God's love and grace and mercy was for everybody. Thankfully, because that's why we're here today. And then Paul had to write to the Christians in Rome, saying not only do they need to love everybody and accept everybody when they come to faith, but also that those new communities of faith should never give the impression that their older brother was past it and that God somehow was finished with them. The story is left unfinished. And I don't know about you, but I kind of want to know what happened next. Do you know, where did they go from there? Was the young brother really changed? Did the older brother ever come to the point where they could be reconciled? Usually when the storyteller does that, it's to make us think where we fit into the story, to learn more about ourselves and our relationship with God and with others. Some of us are like the young man. Even if we don't intend it, we have drifted away from God. And we don't really know God or anything about God. And yet he's there, waiting and watching, desperate to have us come and to be with him and to be in relationship with him, because that's what a good father wants for his children. Some of us are like the older brother. We like what we have, and we're not really that willing to accept other folk. I don't know where you are, but what I do know is that there is a Father in heaven who loves us more than we'll ever know, who gave everything for us because he loves us. Amen.